What happens when a well-dressed black man walks into a bank to withdraw his own money, yet ends up being treated like a threat? No raised voice, no broken rules, just calm words, full documents, and a silence that exposed something deeper. He didn't walk in demanding special treatment. He walked in with the same expectation every customer should have, to be treated with respect. But respect, in that room, had rules, and not everyone had the same access to them. This is not just a story about one man and one bank. It's about what happens when quiet dignity meets quiet discrimination, and the system finds itself on the wrong side of the mirror. Let me show you what really happened that day. The overhead lights in the bank flickered slightly, casting a pale hue over the polished floors and numbered windows. Daniel Carter stood quietly near the back of the line, his frame composed, his eyes calm. Dressed in a dark wool coat and a flat cap, nothing about him drew attention. That was the point. He wasn't here to be noticed. Just a simple transaction. Withdraw $15,000 from his own account. In front of him, a man in khakis and a Bears sweatshirt was laughing with the teller. No ID, no questions. Just a casual request, followed by a stack of bills handed over the counter. Daniel didn't look surprised. He'd seen this before. He'd been in rooms where others were assumed to belong, and he was the one asked to prove it. Still, he waited. Patient, silent, observant. When it was his turn, he approached window 3. The nameplate read, Lauren Mitchell. She didn't smile. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, and her eyes scanned him for a moment too long before settling on his face. He gave her a courteous nod, reached into his coat, and handed over his bank card and ID. "I'd like to make a withdrawal, please," he said, voice calm and steady. $15,000. Lauren hesitated. Her eyes flicked down to the card, then to the screen, then back up to him. "That's a large amount," she replied, not offering a greeting, not moving to type. "Do you have documentation for that request?" Daniel paused, just slightly. "It's my account. I can verify anything you need." There was a silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind that feels like a test. Daniel felt the shift, subtle but sharp, like a room's temperature changing without warning. Behind him, someone in line cleared their throat. Lauren still hadn't touched her keyboard. What struck Daniel wasn't the delay. It was the contrast. He had just watched another man withdraw more without a single question. And now here he was, treated like a problem before he'd even finished his sentence. But Daniel didn't push. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. Instead, he offered something more disarming. Stillness. And from the corner of the lobby, just beyond the glass door of the manager's office, someone else had begun to watch. Lauren finally placed her fingers on the keyboard, but only to bring up a system window. She didn't type anything related to Daniel's request. Instead, she leaned slightly to her left, as if to block his view of the screen. "I'm going to need to verify a few things before I can proceed," she said, voice clipped, almost rehearsed. "Withdrawals over $10,000 require a secondary clearance." Daniel's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "The gentleman before me withdrew 20. I didn't see him provide anything." Lauren didn't flinch. "Each case is different," she replied, eyes not meeting his. It was the kind of answer built to end conversations, not justify actions. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, then calmly reached into his briefcase. He laid down a printed account statement, a copy of his company's tax filings, and a secondary form of identification. No drama, just quiet precision. Lauren glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "There's a process," she added. "Apparently not for everyone," Daniel replied, voice still level. "You didn't ask the last customer for any of this." From across the lobby, behind the glass, Nancy Blake had seen enough. The bank manager stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt with both hands before stepping out into the room. She didn't walk with urgency. She didn't ask questions. She simply approached the counter, eyes set on Lauren first, then on Daniel, with a smile that didn't reach her voice. "Is there a concern here?" she asked. Daniel turned to her with polite directness. "Only that I seem to be held to a different standard." Nancy didn't answer him. She looked at Lauren, then gave the smallest of nods, barely visible, but it landed heavy. Lauren straightened. "Sir," Nancy said, folding her hands, "for security purposes, large cash withdrawals from personal accounts sometimes require extra verification. It's not about you, it's about protocol." Daniel glanced toward the security cameras mounted above the counters. Then I trust this protocol is recorded and applied equally? Nancy smiled again, but this time it wavered. The line behind him had grown. No one spoke, but a few customers had started to listen. Still, Daniel remained composed. The kind of compose that makes people nervous when they're used to getting away with discomfort. He'd seen this before. So had many in the line behind him. But most had chosen not to speak when it was their turn. Daniel had made a different choice, just by standing still. Nancy Blake didn't respond to Daniel's last remark. She didn't need to. Her eyes had already moved past him, toward the far left corner of the lobby where the security station stood tucked behind a pane of dark glass. With a barely perceptible tilt of her chin, she gave a silent command. It was the kind of signal that comes from years of power, not words. She turned back to Daniel with a rehearsed expression of concern. "I understand this feels uncomfortable," she said, "but our policies are designed to protect all clients, yourself included." Daniel held his ground, not out of defiance, but principle. "Then why wasn't that protection offered to the white gentleman before me?" Nancy's smile hardened. "I wasn't present for that interaction," she said, a lie Daniel could read plain on her face. "But if you're unable to comply with the necessary verification, we'll unfortunately have to pause this transaction." He could feel the shift in the room. The background murmur of small talk and keyboard taps had faded. Eyes were watching now. From customers, from tellers, from the glass-walled office above where decisions were usually made quietly, without confrontation. But Nancy hadn't expected Daniel to stay calm for this long, and that made him harder to dismiss. He didn't argue. He didn't step back. Instead, he laid his hand gently on the stack of documents he had already provided. "Everything you need is right here," he said, "unless the issue isn't paperwork, but me." Behind him, the glass door clicked open. A soft, metallic sound. The presence of someone new entering the moment without announcing themselves. Frank Malone, the head of security, stepped into view. Tall, broad, with a practiced stillness in his gait, Frank made his way toward them with slow, deliberate steps. He looked to Nancy. She gave him a look that wasn't quite a nod, but was just enough. Daniel turned his head slightly, registering the movement, but didn't shift his posture. He had seen men like Frank before. Not bad men, but men trained to enforce boundaries set by others. Frank stood behind him now, silent, waiting for Daniel to step out of line, say the wrong thing, raise his voice just enough to justify a removal. But Daniel did none of that, because this wasn't new, and some battles aren't fought with noise. They're fought with how long you're willing to stand still. Frank Malone didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence beside Daniel said enough. A message cloaked in professionalism. "It's time for you to go." Daniel didn't move. He reached instead into his coat pocket, not fast, not sudden, and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera and hit record. Nancy's eyes narrowed. "This is unnecessary," she said quickly, the edge of irritation breaking through her customer service tone. "No," Daniel answered, keeping his voice steady. The lens pointed downward toward the counter and the documents he had already provided. "What's unnecessary is being treated like a suspect for withdrawing my own money." The phone didn't shake in his hand. His posture didn't change. But the entire atmosphere in the bank shifted. A few customers stepped back. One or two quietly took out their own phones, not recording, not yet, but ready. Frank glanced toward Nancy, seeking a cue. She gave another small gesture. "Sir," Frank said, his voice low, "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Daniel turned his head toward him. "Am I being detained?" "No, sir." "Am I violating any law?" Frank paused. "You're disrupting business. I'm standing here, calmly, with documentation, and now recording for my protection." Nancy stepped forward. "We're asking you to leave, Mr. Carter." Daniel looked at her, then down at the documents still untouched on the counter. The silence that followed wasn't just between him and Nancy. It stretched across the lobby like a curtain of judgment. Everyone saw it, but no one spoke. So Daniel did the only thing left to do. He picked up his documents, kept the camera rolling, and turned toward the exit. Frank walked beside him, close but not aggressive. Escorting, not arresting. Removing, not resolving. They passed the line of waiting customers. Some looked away, some nodded subtly. And somewhere near the back, an older black woman shifted her purse and whispered to no one in particular. "Same story, different day." At the door, Frank held it open. Daniel paused before crossing the threshold. He turned back one last time, not to speak but to look. Not at Lauren, not at Nancy, but at the camera above the teller booths, still blinking red, still recording. Sometimes the most powerful protest is making sure someone else has to watch it later. The glass door closed behind Daniel with a soft hiss. Outside, the cold pressed in gently, like a quiet reminder that even the air out here didn't offer warmth after what had just happened. He stood still on the sidewalk, not moving, letting the moment settle. His phone was still recording. Not to provoke, not to rant, just to have something real. Proof that none of this was exaggerated or imagined. Behind him, the reflections in the glass shifted. Frank had returned inside. The customers, the tellers, the room, they went on as if nothing had happened, as if Daniel had simply been a pause in their day. A brief discomfort now removed. But a few seconds later, the door opened again. This time it wasn't Frank. A younger guard stepped out. Trim-build, black, early 30s. His name tag read, Andre Hill. He didn't speak at first, just walked up beside Daniel and held something out. Daniel looked down. It was his secondary ID, the one he'd placed on the counter but had forgotten in the exchange. "You left this," Andre said quietly. Daniel took it, nodding. "Appreciate it." Andre hesitated. Then, in a voice low enough that no one inside could hear, he added, "I saw the whole thing. Happens more than people think." Daniel met his eyes. Not in anger, not in pity. Just a kind of worn-out recognition. The kind two men share when they've both had to carry themselves a certain way just to get through the day. "I know," Daniel replied. Andre looked down the street, then back toward the bank. "Some folks in there, they think policy covers bias like paint over rust." Daniel allowed himself a small breath, not quite a laugh. "Paint peels." Andre cracked a brief smile. Not a happy one, just honest. He took a small step back. "Just wanted to say, the way you handled it, that mattered." Daniel nodded again. So did this. No handshake, no big moment. Just a man returning another man's ID and a little of his dignity. Inside the branch, the atmosphere had already begun to normalize. Tellers resumed typing. Lauren glanced at her monitor, pretending to scroll through system logs. Nancy Blake returned to her office with brisk, self-assured steps. To the untrained eye, it was over. But the security cameras had been running the entire time, and not just for safety. Every frame was saved to a corporate server. Half a mile away, Richard Hale sat in a corner office high above Michigan Avenue, watching that footage in silence. He hadn't planned to visit the branch today, but an alert had been triggered, one of the system's embedded flags designed to detect possible customer conflict. At first, he expected to dismiss it. Minor complaint, misunderstandings, maybe a refund, and a formal apology letter. But as he watched Daniel stand still, watched him offer paperwork, watched him stay composed while being quietly pushed aside, his stomach sank. It wasn't just the footage, it was the familiarity. Richard had built this branch. Not the bricks, but the policies. He had trained Nancy, had signed off on Lauren's hiring, and what he saw wasn't a rogue mistake. It was something worse, a reflection of what the institution had allowed to grow under the surface. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and headed for the elevator. No calls, no emails, no press statement, just a black company car, cold leather seats, and a silent ride toward something he could no longer ignore. Back at the bank, Nancy was reviewing an internal memo when the door swung open. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. Lauren looked up and froze. Frank stepped back instinctively. Andre, who had just returned to his post, stood a little straighter. Richard didn't say a word as he walked in. He didn't need to. Nancy's face shifted just enough, eyebrows raised, mouth tightening, not in confusion, but in calculation. She knew this visit wasn't for a courtesy check. "Where is he?" Richard asked. "He left," Nancy replied. "Why?" She hesitated. "There was a disagreement, a withdrawal issue. He refused protocol." Richard turned toward Lauren. "Was the account active?" Lauren's lips parted slightly. "Yes." "Was he the primary holder?" "Yes." "Did you verify identity?" "Yes, but did you apply the same scrutiny to the man before him?" No answer. Andre stood still by the door. His eyes didn't move, but his chest rose slightly, just enough to feel seen. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed his last question was louder than any reprimand. He stood at the center of the branch, coat still on, gloves in hand, looking not just at Lauren or Nancy, but at the space itself, like he was seeing it for the first time after years of thinking he knew what it stood for. Nancy adjusted her blazer and stepped forward, her tone measured. "Richard, I understand this looks troubling, but we were following internal guidelines." "No," Richard cut in, his voice even but sharper now. "You were following comfort, your own." Lauren shifted uneasily. The remaining customers, now reduced to a couple of quiet onlookers, tried not to stare, but the weight of the moment was thick enough to pull everyone in. "I watched the footage," Richard said. "Every second. What I saw wasn't caution, it was assumption. You didn't treat Mr. Carter like a client. You treated him like a question that needed defending against." Nancy opened her mouth again, but Richard raised a hand. "I'm not here to mediate your version of events. I'm here to address what's already undeniable." He turned to Andre. "You were on duty?" "Yes, sir," Andre replied. "You approached Mr. Carter?" "No, sir. I stood back, but I returned his ID after the incident. He had left it behind." "And how did you treat him?" Andre paused. "Like a man who deserved better." Richard nodded once. "And for that, you're going to hear two words very few people hear in this building." Andre blinked. "Yes, sir?" "Thank you." There was a stillness, a kind of internal recalibration across the room. Nancy lowered her gaze, and Lauren stared down at her screen, frozen. Richard turned back toward them. "I want a full report, but let me be clear. If either of you had taken 3 seconds to check the account before defaulting to suspicion, this entire conversation wouldn't exist." Nancy took a step forward, tone lowered. "What do you want us to do?" Richard looked at her, without resentment, but without hesitation. "Step aside, today." He didn't shout. He didn't explain. Because in that moment he wasn't just speaking as an executive, he was answering a deeper question. What do we do when we see it happen again, in plain sight? We stop pretending it's complicated. Richard stood near the center of the lobby, the quiet after his words settling like dust in the air. Nancy didn't respond. Lauren stayed frozen at her station. It wasn't fear that filled the room, it was clarity, the kind that arrives too late for some and just in time for others. He turned to Andre. "You've been working here how long?" "Almost 3 years, sir," Andre answered, still unsure of where this was heading. "You've ever been written up?" "No, sir." "Ever had a complaint?" "No, sir." Richard stepped closer. "Then here's what's going to happen," he said, keeping his eyes on Andre. "You'll report to the regional office next Monday. We're moving you out of this branch. You're being promoted to oversight supervisor for client conduct." Andre's eyebrows rose, not in disbelief, but in the quiet disbelief of someone who never expected fairness to come this directly. "You mean that?" he asked. "I don't say things I don't mean." Andre nodded slowly. It wasn't joy that showed on his face. It was a kind of release, the weight of 3 years of silence lifting just enough to let a breath in. Richard turned toward the entrance. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have someone to speak to." As he moved to leave, he paused and looked back toward the 2 women still standing near the counter. "I'll ask Mr. Carter if he wants you removed permanently, but between us," he said, voice calm, "you've already removed yourselves." Then he walked out. The door closed behind him with the same soft hush it had for Daniel earlier, but this time it didn't shut out a problem. It let in accountability. On the sidewalk, Daniel was still standing where Andre had left him. He didn't look surprised when Richard approached, just watchful. Like a man who'd learned not to expect much, but still hoped someone might show up different. Richard extended a hand. "Mr. Carter, I owe you more than an apology." Daniel didn't take the hand right away. Instead, he studied the man in front of him. "I'm listening," Daniel said. "Good," Richard replied, "because I'm not here to talk. I'm here to ask what you want done." Daniel didn't blink. "You've already done it." A pause. "But let me ask you something," he added. "You ever walked into one of your branches, dressed like I am now?" Richard shook his head. "No." "Maybe you should." There was no anger in his voice, no sarcasm. Just a truth dropped gently in front of someone who might finally pick it up. Richard nodded, accepting it. Daniel gave him one final look. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. His ID back in his pocket, his phone off, and his dignity exactly where it should have been all along. Daniel didn't rush. He walked slowly, each step steady, like a man reclaiming space that had briefly been taken from him. At the corner, he paused to check his watch, not out of habit, but to mark the moment. There was no press, no crowd, no applause, just a cool breeze moving down the block and the faint hum of city noise returning to its rhythm. He heard footsteps behind him, not hurried, measured. Andre approached, now without his uniform jacket. In his hand was a folded piece of paper, an updated contact card from the regional office. Fresh print, fresh title. Guess it's official, Andre said. Daniel looked at the card, then at Andre. Not a bad day after all, Daniel said quietly. Andre tucked the card into his back pocket. I'm still figuring out what to say to my mom. She used to tell me to keep my head down, follow orders, and things would sort themselves out. If you've ever been dismissed because of how you looked, sounded, or stood your ground, remember this. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard by the right person at the right time. Type 1 if you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Type 2 if you believe quiet integrity can still change the course of things. And if stories like this speak to something you felt but never saw on the news, consider subscribing. We bring forward the voices that often go unheard.